Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cold War Spaces, our now every other weekly series. Today, I'd like to welcome our guest today, Ksenia and Nouril, who will be speaking on the topic of Dreamworld space, Soviet intersections between art and science. She's an art historian and Jensen Bryan curator at the Print Center in Philadelphia, and she's organized numerous exhibitions for museums and nonprofit institutions. From 2015 to 2017, she was a contemporary and modern art perspectives fellow at MoMA, and she curated the exhibition Dreamworld and Catastrophes, Intersections of Art and Technology in the Dodge Collection at the Zimmerli Art Museum in 2016, and then an expanded version at the Bruce Museum in 2018. She's published 2 books, Art and Theory of Post-1989 Central and Eastern Europe, a critical anthology, and Ilya Kabakov and Viktor Pivovarov, Stories About Ourselves. Her writings have appeared in international exhibition catalogs, magazines, and academic journals, including Art Margins Online, Calvert Journal, and others. So today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Ksenia and Segal, the Wende's chief curator and director of programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. Please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time, and please keep them concise, no longer than a sentence or 2, so we can try to get to everyone's. And as we're getting started, you can say hi in the chat and what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page and also in podcast format on our SoundCloud afterwards. Lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now Yus will begin us with the conversation, and thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Anna Rose and Ksenia. Welcome to Cold War Spaces. Great to have you.
Thank you so much. I am very excited to be collaborating with you and the Wende Museum, the museum that I've really admired for so many years, as our interests are very mutually intertwined. I couldn't think of a better collaborator and interlocutor to have this conversation with today.
Fantastic, thank you. So I wanted to start with an exhibition you organized in 2018 under the title Hot Art in a Cold War, Intersections of Art and Science in the Soviet Era, which was on view at the Bruce Museum of Art and Science in Greenwich, Connecticut. Can you tell us a little bit about the motivating ideas for that exhibition? What's behind it? What was the story behind it?
Yeah, I will be glad to tell you more about that. I have to step back a little bit, actually, because a lot precipitated that exhibition at the Bruce Museum in 2018. So for several years prior, I had been a PhD student and a curatorial fellow at the Zimmerli Art Museum at Rutgers University. That institution is home of the Dodge collection of Soviet nonconformist art, which is the largest collection of art made in the Soviet Union between roughly 1950 and 1991. And this artwork was made not in the style of socialist realism, which was the official style of art in the Soviet Union. So I worked for almost 8 years with that collection. And as part of that work, I was curating exhibitions, including one called Dreamworlds and Catastrophes, Art and Technology in the Dodge collection, which was mentioned by Anna Rose in the introduction. And so that exhibition took place in 2016 at the Zimmerli, and it looked at the way artists from the Dodge collection envisioned science, whether that was the nuclear bomb or the space race or other kinds of inventions that were happening in the mid-20th century. I was approached by the curators from the Bruce Museum to travel that exhibition to the Bruce. And again, I couldn't think of a better place to travel it because, as you already mentioned, it's a museum dedicated to art and science. And so their dual mission really suited my topic and allowed me, as well as my co-curator at the Bruce, Dr. Daniel Ksepka, to expand upon it. And so we included many of the artworks that were in the Zimmerli Art Museum exhibition, but complemented them with material objects. So actually scientific objects, space suits, nuclear radiation suits. We even had a tree trunk, a piece of a tree trunk from Chernobyl in the exhibition to show how the radiation affected the trees at that location. And so it was this really wonderful marriage between art and science that was very well received by the museum and its community.
Right, thank you. Yeah, we had an earlier Cold War Spaces interview with Kate Brown about Chernobyl and the impact it had. So yeah, lots of references and cross-references there. And the exhibitions you mentioned were focused on, as you explained, unofficial art. Can you tell us a little bit what was the difference between official and unofficial art in the Soviet Union? And also, does unofficial art mean more or less the same as, for instance, counterculture art, underground art, dissident art? Can you clarify that a little bit? Yeah.
It's a very kind of sticky topic, right? So to sort of give a blanket definition of what's official and unofficial is really challenging, right? I think it's easy to say that official art in the Soviet Union was socialist realism. Declared in 1934 at the Writers' Congress, socialist realism was a kind of art that was supposed to depict the reality of Soviet experience. As we all know, it often didn't depict a reality, but in fact, in a way, a dream world of what communism could be, right? So it is things like a very, robust worker, or a very, beautiful farmscape, showing how bountiful and strong and wonderful the people and the country are. But unfortunately, that was not always the case. Now, unofficial art is a little more complicated because it's a very broad term and it encompassed so many different kinds of styles, so many different kinds of artists, so many different kinds of interests in art. It could be interpreted as dissident art, which is art with a political underpinning, artists who were actively pursuing political agendas against the Soviet state. But it also could be an artist who simply did not want to practice socialist realist painting or sculpture and decided to make work that was abstract or maybe perhaps religious in nature because that artist personally wanted to express those things and had no political agenda or no social agenda and simply just wanted to make art in a different kind of style. And so there are, there's not one look of unofficial art. It comes in all different shapes and sizes and forms, artists who are younger, artists who are older. The main distinction is that these artists were not actively exhibiting this work in public venues. The work was not supported by the state as artwork in the Soviet Union was, as artists who were part of the Union of Artists were supported with materials and other financial remunerations from the state. These artists, unofficial artists, did not have that support. They did not have exhibition venues. They were not given materials or supplies. And so their work was really driven by their own passion and their own determination.
Right. Oh, that's a very clear explanation. Thank you. I was wondering, would you say that unofficial artists, generally speaking, had a different approach to science and technology than official artists?
Well, this is where things get even stickier. So I'm glad you asked that question. So one thing I discovered through my research for these two exhibitions was that there were actually many intersections between unofficial artists and official scientists or other official bodies. So science, in this way, became the nexus for exchange between these two worlds that were otherwise very disparate and parallel. But this is where they intersected. So for example, in Soviet Russia, there was a group called Движение, which translates roughly to movement group. And it was a group of, a loose group of artists, 6, 7, 8 artists at any given time who were based out of Moscow. And they were interested in kinetic art and kineticism, how things move. And they were formed in 1962. And in 1966, they published a manifesto called the Kinetic Manifesto, which stated their goals and their aims for their artwork. And throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, when they began to disband, they worked directly with scientists and other individuals who were employed by the Soviet state. So for example, they often collaborated with, even exhibited at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Physics, which is also in Moscow. And they also exhibited in certain official venues like Vydncha, which is the exhibition grounds in Moscow. And at Vydncha, they exhibited their work in a show dedicated to glass and crystal. So they found different ways to infiltrate official life in the Soviet Union because their works were often focused and rooted in a kind of engineering and a kind of architecture. It was very easy for them to veil their artworks as perhaps industrial design or as a kind of architectural design. And so it allowed them to really push the boundaries. And through my research, I found a lot of artists in the 1960s specifically using the materiality of their work, whether it's made of plastic or glass or certain kinds of metals, to push these boundaries beyond the quote unquote art world or the arts, right? And they were exhibiting, therefore, in many more places than perhaps their counterparts that were limited to painting or sculpture or photography.
I see, yeah. So how did these partnerships come about? Were, generally speaking, the artists the ones who contacted the scientists? Was it the other way around? Did both happen? Do you know those
well, I think
relationships?
It's a great question. There are many different relationships, and I can't recount them all, but I will give you another example that highlights the kinds of relationships that were being built at that time. So in Latvia, in Soviet Latvia, which is a republic on the Baltic Sea, there is an artist who is still alive and practicing, Valdis Salms. And Salms engaged in official activity through an open call system. So he produced a project called the Positron for an open call for a monumental structure at a factory, a Soviet state factory in Ivano-Frankivsk, Ukraine. So he submitted his designs, his maquettes, for this monumental structure to this open call. And this positron, which is again directly related to a scientific term, a positron is a positive electron. And it was a spherical sculpture, very, very large, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, the size of an average human, that frankly looks like a disco ball if you look it up. And this structure was meant to rotate, to emit different color lights, and also emit sound. And so Salms, again, also very interested in a kind of kineticism, was proposing this for this factory as a means of boosting worker morale. So the impetus behind his project was actually very much geared towards a kind of uplifting of the Soviet man, of the Soviet woman, and the Soviet state. Unfortunately, this project was never built. It only exists in these maquettes and sketches that are part of the Dodge collection at the Zimmerli Art Museum. And it does make one wonder, the way in which art and science could work together for positive outcomes, right? Because that's also something that really fascinated me in my research, was how art and science could be used for positive outcomes, but also negative outcomes, right? And this is a very interesting dichotomy at this very critical time of geopolitics during the Cold War.
Yeah, this kind of relationship between art and science reminds me actually of the late 1910s, when many of the avant-garde artists were also thinking in terms of very practical solutions for real world problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. People like Lissitzky. And in fact, they were the precedent for some of these artists. So part of Движение, the movement group that I spoke about a few minutes ago, was an artist called Viachislav Kolachuk. And if you look up Kolachuk's sculptures, some of which were in both of my exhibitions, you will see that they are very reminiscent of the early avant-garde. In fact, you might even mistake his sculptures for a sculpture by Vladimir Tatlin or Alexander Rodchenko. You might not be able to tell the difference. But Kolachuk was looking back at that early avant-garde period, looking back to their aesthetics, but also looking back to their sort of sensibility, the kind of socio-political outlooks that they had in vis-a-vis their relationship with the state.
Right. So one of the artworks or projects actually that was part of these exhibitions from the movement group is called Altar for the Temple of the Spirit, which I think is quite remarkable, especially in a Soviet state that is so anti-religion. So what kind of project was that? And was it really intended to promote spiritual consciousness or something like that?
Yeah, I think the movement group had a kind of spirituality about them because they were so very interested in kineticism and kind of the way in which materials were able to be combined and the relationship between materials and the viewer. So very interested in kind of like the affect of artwork. I think that they embodied a kind of spiritualism that was, kind of mysticism, let's say, that wasn't necessarily a religiosity aligned with any sort of Catholicism or Judaism or Christianity, but kind of was very much its very own kind of self. And that mysticism was very much guided by a kind of science, right? Or at least a pseudoscience, because they themselves were not scientists per se, or not exclusively scientists, let's say. And so this altar, which actually in its material form is a collage, right? It is a drawing that is then superimposed with cut out photographs of people. And so they in fact envisioned people in this incredibly large and crystalline space that was never built. As much of these artworks were never built. I think it's a kind of theme you can see through all of them. And yet it was something that they aimed for. And the initial exhibition, Dreamworlds and Catastrophes, references a book by Susan Buck-Morse, who is a very well-known and excellent scholar of Slavic studies and of comparative literature. And she wrote a book a number of years ago called Dreamworld and Catastrophe. It really is a meditation on the Soviet Union. And what for me that kind of embodied, and what the work of a group like Dvizhenia, or this work that you mentioned, the altar, embodies, is a kind of hopefulness, right? A kind of vision that was forward-looking, that perhaps things in the Soviet Union were not exactly what one would like. They were maybe a bit catastrophic. However, through art, and especially through the intersections of art and science, one could envision a more hopeful or a brighter future. And of course, as I already mentioned, that's a double-edged sword, because science had obviously been used to advance humanity, but unfortunately, science has also been used to humanity's detriment.
Right, so that's where the catastrophe comes in. I was wondering, speaking about these intersections between art and science, did the artist and the scientist also connect to artists and scientists beyond the Soviet sphere, for instance, in the West, or also in the global South, maybe? Was this a global phenomenon, or was this a typical Soviet phenomenon?
Well, the phenomenon in the Soviet Union was very strong. As I've already mentioned, the exhibitions looked at not just work in Soviet Russia, but also in the Baltic republics, so Latvia and Lithuania, Estonia, as I mentioned, also Ukraine. And so within the Soviet Union, there were very deep and strong connections across the republics between artists and scientists. There was ability to travel between those republics as well. Traveling beyond the Soviet Union was a bit more challenging. And of course, at the time, you have to remember, it was the Cold War, and the tensions specifically between the United States and the Soviet Union were very intense. And therefore, the exchange between those countries was both very sort of pregnant with potential, but at the same time, also very much a forbidden kind of fruit. And so concurrent, I would say, with those explorations in the Soviet Union were explorations beyond. So in the United States, with the space program, many artists were also engaged with that. For example, most famously, someone like Robert Rauschenberg worked for NASA creating artwork. There are many other examples as well. And I think that it, in that sense, was a kind of Cold War phenomenon that artists were interested in science or interested in scientifically driven activities such as the atom bomb or the rockets in the race for space. Right. I think those activities were very much in the forefront of everyone's mind. I mean, people were going into space. Not just people, I mean, behind me, I have an incredible print of all the animals who went to space. So there was this really omnipresent understanding that these activities around space, around nuclear war, I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis happening in the 1960s as well, were very much like a part of people's everyday lives. I mean, as we all know, I mean, the threat of nuclear war haunted people and had people preparing, bomb shelters and other sorts of emergency supplies in the event of a catastrophe.
Right. So speaking about the space race, how would you compare the artistic responses in the Soviet Union and the United States?
Well, I think, you have to keep in mind that artists may have had access to certain kinds of information or certain kinds of imagery. I mean, people had access to certain kinds of information and kind of imagery in terms of what was displayed on the television or what kinds of photographs circulated in the newspaper, right? But artists, of course, took all that one step farther. So, for example, in the exhibition at the Zimmerli, unfortunately, this work did not travel to the Bruce Museum. You had artists like Vitaly Sherstyuk, who were actually painting astronauts in these very large-scale, monumental, nearly socialist realist-like paintings. They were paintings in the style of a hyper-realism. They really brought these scenes of space and of space travel alive. Sometimes artists would actually depict real astronauts. There would be portraits of astronauts who had been to space, and they memorialized them in these portraits. Leica, going back to the idea of animals in space, also became a very popular trope used by artists in the Soviet Union. Leica was the first dog sent into space. And Leica unfortunately perished and became quite a symbol of what could be. And unfortunately at the time, no one knew that she sort of perished the way she did, but that information came out much later. But at the time she was sort of heralded as this, magnificent kind of an example of magnificent progress on behalf of the Soviet Union. So her face became the cover of cookie tins and cigarette packages, but also paintings and sculptures and other kinds of fine art as well.
Right. And how would you compare that to someone like Rauschenberg or other American artists picking up this topic?
Well, I think in the case of Rauschenberg, he was incorporating this imagery also into his work. I mean, Rauschenberg working in a kind of style that involved kind of a collage aesthetic, a sort of a means of cutting and pasting different inspirational images or inspirational ideas into his works. And I think the idea of the astronaut or the idea of space became a part of that language of his. It became embedded in his vocabulary. And so I think, each artist took the ideas that were very prevalent at the time, took the kinds of imagery that was very prevalent at the time through things like mass media, newspapers and television, and interpreted them in their own ways through their work.
Right. Thank you. You also mentioned nuclear power. And of course, that can be a very ambiguous topic with, on the one hand, the peaceful use in terms of energy, and on the other, nuclear weapons. which are extremely destructive. So how was this dichotomy in the approach of nuclear power reflected in Soviet art? And maybe also you spoke about Chernobyl. How did the disaster in Chernobyl impact that response?
Mm-hmm. Well, an example from the show that was both at the Zimmerli and Bruce Museum was a work by Inars Helmuts, who is a Latvian artist who is a printmaker primarily. And the work I have in mind is a triptych that shows the different kind of portions or parts of a nuclear reactor. And this print, which really captures the kind of tension that exists between the positives and the abilities of nuclear power and its destructive side. It is a very haunting print. It's almost like an altarpiece in 3 parts, but it is sort of very morbid and kind of dark in that sense. It doesn't give you kind of the faith and the hope perhaps a kind of Renaissance altarpiece would provide for you. And I think, the nuclear race is very important because it allowed the space race to continue, right? So by building the atom bomb, by creating the rocket in relation to nuclear power and nuclear bombs, we were able to shoot spaceships into space, and we were able to put, humans on the moon. And so the fact that something so positive like exploring space was built on the back of something so negative, the atom bomb basically, is pretty incredible, of course. And the artists, someone like Helmuts, had access through friends or through different networks to places like nuclear power stations. So they were able to actually go and observe these facilities and able to translate them directly into their work. And again, that kind of was another way artists transgressed perhaps some of the secrecy that it was, encompassing those in the Soviet Union, that things couldn't be shared, that things couldn't be shown. But through artwork, a lot of information was accumulated and shared. Another example, from Estonia is Raul Mail. Now, his work is also in print, and it's not necessarily showing us the kind of machinations of a nuclear power plant or a nuclear reactor, but they are kinds of mathematically driven graphs that are aimed at the cosmos. And so I think things like Chernobyl changed the narrative a little bit, probably more than a little bit, after the disaster in 1986, because the real catastrophes of nuclear power came to the fore. And in our exhibition at the Bruce Museum, we showed that not only through the artworks that I just mentioned, but also the kinds of materiality and the material culture, like a Geiger counter and a radioactive protection suit, or the tree trunk that I mentioned earlier in this conversation.
Right. Thank you. So it's almost 12:30 in Los Angeles, which means that we are almost heading to the Q&A. And please, if you have questions, put them under the Q&A box where I will be looking. Before we go there, I would like to ask you one final question. And it so happens that the Getty Foundation PhD program for 2024 is about the intersection of art and science. I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit. What do you see nowadays as the importance of the meeting space between art and science? And how could art and science maybe work together to address the big issues we are all confronted with on a global scale these days?
I think it's just as, if not more important than it was during the Cold War. I think that what we can learn a lot of lessons from the Cold War and the way in which art and science engaged with one another in the Cold War. I think while science has advanced astronomically since the 1960s, 1970s, I think that this duality of science, that it is both something positive and something negative, is ever present. And so I think by looking back at these artists who were practicing in the Soviet Union specifically, artists today can learn a lot from them, can be guided by them, and not just in terms of how they made their artwork, how it looks aesthetically, but also how they negotiated different relationships, as we talked about extensively, those between sort of official and unofficial institutes or spheres. I feel like the Cold War in general is still a very present topic in our everyday existence. There's just this past weekend, I was watching a really good movie available on Amazon Prime called The Courier, which tells a true story of a British individual who was, enlisted to courier information back and forth between the USSR and Britain, and he was working with the Americans as well. And so these kinds of narratives, these kinds of stories from the Cold War are really still evident in our everyday lives today. And I think the relationships there are very strong. So I'm fascinated by this proposal for the PST this year and look forward to what is going to come out of it.
Great, thank you very much. I saw one question asking about the spelling of the Latvian artist Valdis Celms.
Oh, that was Valdis Celms. I mentioned a few Latvian artists. I'll spell the other one. I sent one in because the print artist was Inars Helmuts, and Valdis Celms is the other artist I mentioned from Latvia.
Right.
Thanks for your interest in that. I really appreciate everyone who's come out today to hear us talk more about this very important subject.
Right. And while I'm waiting for other questions under the Q&A, I have a few other ones I can ask you in between. And one is about soc art, and specifically the artists Vitaly Komar and Alexander Melamed, who started this movement. They also were engaged in, for instance, the space race, etc. Can you tell a little bit about, first of all, what soc art is, and then how they responded to the space race?
Sure. Soc art is one example of one of the many faces of unofficial art, as we were talking about earlier in this conversation. So soc art was coined by these two artists, Vitaly Komar and Alexander Melamed, who were working together initially in Moscow and then eventually in New York City once they immigrated in the 1970s. And their, let's say, take on unofficial art involved using the kinds of tropes of socialist realism. So let's say portraits of Stalin or other Soviet leaders, military parades, other kinds of symbols of the Soviet state, and sort of presenting them in sarcastic or very kind of let's say, funny ways. So they did not present Stalin in the way an official artist would present him, clearly a hero and a god among men, but they would place him in kinds of awkward situations and funny tableaus, let's say, that would poke fun at his importance and at his stature. And so their artwork, which ranged in medium, they produced paintings, they produced photographs, performances, installation work as well, really created a kind of alternative mythology for the Soviet state. So it was using the characters that were part of the official mythology, Stalin and others, but they were giving them a different narrative. And that narrative was very critical, yet at the same time sarcastic and even a bit humorous. And
well, did they get away with it in the Soviet Union? Or?
Well, yes. I mean, this is a very popular question. Did unofficial artists in general get away with it? Not everyone, unfortunately. I mean, there are plenty of examples of unofficial artists who had, been caught making this work, sharing this work, selling this work. I mean, selling is a kind of strange concept in a non-capitalist economy, but and they had been imprisoned for this work. Melamede and Komar specifically, not exactly. I mean, they chose eventually to immigrate, and in immigration, they were able to continue to make their work very successfully. Still, at the same time, against the kind of friction of the Soviet state.
Right. Thank you.
To clarify and put a real fine point in it, just because an artist was unofficial did not mean that they were political, and also did not mean that they were ever persecuted for their artwork. There are, of course, examples of artists who were political and also persecuted but that is not necessary or exclusive for an artist to be an unofficial artist. And that's why the concept is very interesting.
Right. Thank you. We have a question from Anna Timberlake. She asks, how was the Soviet-Afghanistan conflict depicted in Soviet art? It was not in the official news in the USSR at the time.
That's a very good question. Obviously, I've been, and many other people have been thinking a lot about the Soviet Afghan war and its repercussions in relationship to what is happening in Afghanistan today. I would say the most evident representation of that war in Soviet art, official or unofficial, has to do kind of with its repercussions, right? The many men and boys who went to fight this war and returned or didn't return, and the kind of sort of depression or melancholy that resulted that resulted from that engaged conflict. And so I don't have necessarily a specific example from you off the top of my head, but I can say that generally within Soviet culture, the kind of malaise that veiled that culture during and immediately after this conflict was very much palpable in works of art, whether that be a painting or a photograph, but also cinema and music, theater. It is a very sad chapter in Soviet history. Yet another sad chapter, I should clarify, in Soviet history.
Right. I have a question from Eric Gordon that relates to the sots art topic. He writes, satire and humor are common literary and aesthetic poses used even by official artists. What were the limits they respected or were imposed on them?
On them being the official artists or them being the unofficial artists? But I guess I can answer in both respects. I mean,
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So Eric, I think that's a very perceptive comment and question, in the sense that yes, even within official work, whether it be a novel or a poem or a painting, artists were practicing subversive techniques, subversive strategies, foremost of which was satire. I think, the limits were literally the censors, and the censors were, I would say, ranged in their sort of predictability. I think what could and couldn't pass through a censor at a certain time. You have to also think about the arc of the Soviet experience, that what was considered acceptable or unacceptable changed depending on when in the Soviet period you're looking at or talking about. So of course, during Stalinism, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, up until Stalin's death in 1953, things were very stringent. There was very little wiggle room in sort of interpreting things, and many people suffered the consequences. However, after Stalin's death, specifically when Nikita Khrushchev took power as premier of the Soviet Union, this was a period of thaw, literally a kind of melting after the really strict, stringent times of Stalin. And so during the thaw, things became a little more loose. People were able to do things that maybe they weren't able to do before. In fact, the thaw was a very, very vibrant time for artistic production, whether it was official or unofficial. In fact, during the thaw, there were examples of unofficial artists being welcomed into official circles, official exhibitions, and other official engagements that would have never been possible just a few years prior. Now, unfortunately, the thaw was very short-lived, and then we kind of move into a stagnation period under Brezhnev, which I always like to kind of think of as more of a hands-off period, but not necessarily a loose period. Brezhnev, as I mentioned, it was known for this kind of economic stagnation at a time when the Soviet Union was really suffering and really setting itself up for its eventual demise in 1991. And so it was a great time of, I categorize it as a kind of great time of sort of bit of a confusion and a sort of a lost period in which people and which artists, were a bit uncertain as to what direction things were moving.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Next question is from Jerry Ferris. She asks, are you familiar with works by Yevgeny Rukhin, 1970s underground artist in Moscow?
Yes, I am very familiar with Rukhin. His works are in the Dodge collection, and he was very much a very important and beloved artist of the collector Norton Dodge, who passed away in 2011. Norton Dodge, he began collecting Soviet nonconformist art in the early 1960s. After visiting the Soviet Union a number of times under the auspices of his dissertation research. He was an economist, a Harvard-trained economist by education, and he lived in the DC, Maryland area. And over the course of, let's say, 4 or 5 decades of travel both to the Soviet Union, but also engagements with artists who lived in diaspora, he amassed a collection of well over 20,000 works of art, a large portion of which is at the Zimmerli Art Museum at Rutgers University. So if you are a big fan of Rukhin, as am I would really recommend you head over to the Zimmerli's website or check out one of the many catalogs that they have published in which Rukhin does appear.
Thank you. I have another question which, thinking about your work, came up. Do you know, were there also intense relations, partnerships between scientists and science fiction writers? And or was there maybe even a community where artists, science fiction writers, and scientists met each other?
That is also a really fruitful avenue when exploring the topic of art and science in the Soviet Union. And it's something that I definitely took into consideration, understanding the kinds of science fiction writing that was popular at the time, kind of science fiction thinking. Although science fiction itself did not play a direct role in the exhibition, even in the Bruce Museum version, we kind of limited our visual material culture to science objects. But that is definitely the backdrop on which this work was being made. And I think, science fiction in the Soviet Union has a very long history. I would root it at least back until the avant-garde period, which we mentioned earlier in this conversation. So there are some incredible examples of literature from that time that envisioned a kind of alternative world, alternative space. There's some wonderful films, like one of my favorite films from the 1920s is definitely Elita, which presents us with this alternative universe, alternative planet. And the film is a silent film that is designed almost, like an avant-garde painting. All of the costumes and all of the sets are this kind of cubo-futurist, constructivist kind of style. And I think, whether it be science fiction writing or whether it be artwork inspired by it, I think what was driving these creative producers was this idea of imagining something else, something different, something more. And maybe in the 1920s, that was the building of a Soviet state, a kind of, a Soviet Union. It was in its nascency, and they were imagining what this idea could become. Perhaps later in the century, in the 1960s and 1970s, artists had a very good idea of what the Soviet Union was by that time, and
Right.
perhaps were a bit dissatisfied with what it was. And so they were then scheming alternative models to even communism or to the Soviet state. And so I think this idea of the pivot around kind of recognizing what they had, but envisioning something different or something else or something more really connects these two periods within the Soviet experience, but also these kinds of cultural production. So whether it be writing or art, fine art, etc.
Right, thank you. So we are officially at the end of our interview, but I don't want to let you go before asking one final question, if I may. So you mentioned Dreamworld and Catastrophe, which was the title of the 2016 exhibition, but also the book by Susan Buck-Morss. And in her book, Susan Buck-Morss not only reflects on Soviet political and cultural history, but also suggests that some of the not the details, but the fragments of Soviet culture that were produced, the hopeful fragments, part of the utopian scheme, could actually still be used in spite of the end of the state socialist ideology to critically reflect on our own society and maybe use it in a positive way. What aspects of Soviet society do you consider are especially fruitful to think about in our time?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Yeah, that's a very loaded question, because you have to acknowledge the, first and foremost, the let's say, let's call them for what they are, the kinds of atrocities of the Soviet state. And so sometimes it can be very hard to think of the positives. However, as a scholar and someone who comes to the material as a researcher, I know that there were many, and in fact, they were expressed in so many ways through our art and culture, in my opinion. And so I think what I've learned through my study of nonconformist art, which includes the works that we've talked about today, but which also includes lengthy studies on artists like Ilya Kabakov or Viktor Pivovarov, who were in no way really related to science, but were practicing between the official and unofficial worlds in the 1970s in Moscow, approximately. And I think what has come of that, and what I really appreciate, is the kind of versatility of artists, but also the perseverance of artists. Someone like Kabakov or Pivovarov, the way in which they negotiated or navigated their existences vis-a-vis the official doctrine or the Soviet state. I think that's something that we today are still grappling with, even though it may not be that kind of entity, but it could be something else. And so I really, I guess that maybe it's their resilience in the face of those obstacles and the strategies which they managed to not just work, but also build specifically community. So I think that what happened, even with the artists we talked about today, that the networks of these artists also buoyed them in these times of great strife or trouble, that they were able to connect and rely upon each other, even if it was in a kind of underground capacity, to sort of give themselves the momentum to move forward. And I think that kind of networked understanding in the advancement of ideas or activities, again, is very much relevant to how we operate today and how other contexts are still operating at this time.
Right. Well, thank you. Fantastic. And I want to thank you overall for a wonderful presentation. It was a great joy to have you in the series. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. I thank everyone who tuned in today. I appreciate it. And everyone else who will listen to this recording in the future.
Right. So in 2 weeks from now, we have a little break in the program. I'm traveling in Europe, but in 4 weeks, we will have our 50th Jubilee Cold War Spaces interview. I'm still waiting for a final confirmation of the speaker, but through our e-newsletter and social media, we'll keep you informed, and would be great to see you back in early October. Thank you for watching.